Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this week's Scholar Chats. I'm here with Dr. Mike Nguyen from the Department of Higher Education at Morgridge College of Education. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're so honored to be able to talk with you this week and so excited to read your article um, for week 2 of our class, which is From Marginalized to Validated, an in-depth case study in Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander serving institution. Dr. Nguyen, can you please tell us how this collaboration came to fruition when you collaborated with all these great scholars on this article?
Yeah, so really it was really just between me and two other really wonderful professors, Ty Nguyen over at Seattle University, and then Dolly Nguyen over at Oregon State University. And actually, it's kind of a funny story. This was back in 2014 at the ASH conference, and where I was just in the lobby of the conference, and I saw Ty there, or Dr. Nguyen there, and I said, "Hey, same last name. We should probably work together on something." And it turned out that we actually have a whole lot of similar research interests with respect to MSIs and anaphyses. And at the time, it was my second year of grad school. Ty had just become an assistant professor at Seattle U, and then Dolly, who's also my year at UCLA. The three of us were just kind of there and got together and started writing because we funny enough, had the same last name. And so that's kind of how the project came together, through a chance meeting in the lobby of a conference hotel during my second year as a PhD student.
Oh, that's amazing. What a great opportunity. uh, so how did you all choose the Full Circle project at Sac State University?
Yeah, so at the time, there was some projects that myself and Dolly and others worked on with Dr. Robert Teranishi on anaphyses, but those were mainly looking at community colleges, right? And that's where a lot of the initial research had come. In fact, the first 3 anaphyses nationally were community colleges, the inaugural 3, as I like to call it. And so with respect to the work that that Ty was doing, was more around four-year universities and 4-year anaphyses. And so the way it sort of worked out was, one, there wasn't a whole lot of work on 4-year anaphyses, is kind of how we that institution, we selected that institution. But also it was something Ty had already been working on. He invited us to join him on this project. So really it's those two things, right? One is that there was not a whole lot of work being done on 4-year anaphyses, and two, Ty had invited, he had already begun doing this work and invited Dolly and myself to come and collaborate with him.
Wow, that's great. And it seems like an incredible program over there too, that it seems like they have it kind of all figured out. So that's amazing.
They're a long-serving 4-year anaphese, and definitely one of the models that other 4-year institutions look to if they're thinking about becoming one.
Wonderful. So we're talking about anaphyses, and this article specifically speaks to Asian Americans and looks at that data. And it also mentions the model minority myth. And I was wondering if you can talk more about this for our students.
Sure. The model minority myth or the model minority concept is something that assumes that all Asian American students are universally successful, high achieving, don't need any assistance or resources, and that's a narrative that's been used to really it's negatively impacted the Asian American community, but it also has been used as a way to position Asian American students against other students of color, and in other words, it is a part of a kind of an issue where one, it makes Asian American students look like they don't need any assistance or resources, but then it also says, hey, look, you've got Black and brown students why can't they work as hard, right? And so it creates this really horrible narrative about kind of all students of color within that higher education system. So, and we know that it's not true, right? Empirical evidence and data shows that Asian American students, like other students of color, are diverse, complex, and need federal resources with respect to MSIs.
For sure. Thank you. So as you mentioned, how they're very complex and different, and the NFPZ federal designation lumps in vastly different ethnicities into one category, right? And the article mentions some challenges, and I was wondering if you could speak to any benefits that may.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again? There's like some construction going on right outside my office.
Of course. So the NFPZ, and I know you have a lot of construction outside of So the NFPZ federal designation, it lumps in vastly very diverse, different ethnicities into one category, right? And I know the article talks about some challenges with that, and I was wondering if there were any benefits.
You mean to kind of aggregating students together?
Right.
Right. So this is an interesting thing going on within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, right? Is that if you read this book that was published years ago, back in the early 90s, by this wonderful scholar named Nguyen the book is called Asian American Pan-Ethnicity, and it essentially talks about this concept of us being aggregated together as a political tool, right? Where we will come together because of our similarities in experiences, or even kind of phenotypically, and together it's a coalition to create and build political power. Now, now there are others who tend to kind of believe in the model minority myth, who then lump Asian Americans together. And then the negative aspect of that is then our diversity is now hidden, where you've got different groups of Asian Americans with very vastly different immigration and refugee histories, who have different educational needs. And so when aggregated together, we tend, those who need resources or tend to be obscured in this larger kind of aggregate, right? And so we often say that data disaggregation is important, because then it shows the complexity and diversity within our community. But of course, there are advantages to being together, and that's usually a political term. But that's a great question, because I have a book chapter coming out next year that actually teases out this concept, and happy to talk about. That's a whole different 2-hour-long conversation about kind of the complexities of this of being aggregated for a political term versus being aggregated together to perpetuate stereotypes about Asian Americans.
Oh, I look forward to that book chapter. That's going to be so unlike HBCUs, NFPZs were once PWIs, right? Predominantly white serving institutions.
That's right.
And the article shared about how NFPZs are serving Southeast Asian Americans at that institution very well, with culturally relevant pedagogies and, with ethnic studies and student service at the hub. Did any of your research find that Native Americans and Pacific Islanders were also feeling that sense of belonging and that validation?
Sure. So this is an interesting thing that I want to kind of share about NFPZs, and I often say that's how we it's how we pronounce this long acronym, right? But really, and it stands for Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institution. But what is really the Native American part of that acronym actually kind of came out in the last minutes of this legislation being passed. And initially, it was created to say Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Serving Institution. And somehow, in some weird legislative thing that no one can actually figure out or track when this happened, or who kind of changed the name from Native Hawaiian to Native American. But actually, we were able to isolate it down to a conference committee of a handful of senators, including then Senator Hillary Clinton, then Senator Barack Obama. So we can ask them who changed the name from Native Hawaiian to Native American. But we think the rationale is simply because there's already a Native Hawaiian serving institution. And so they wanted to change the name to make it a little different. That way it doesn't kind of take it from another pot of federal funds. So the point of this MSI is to actually not serve Native American students, being that we already have tribal colleges and non and another category of schools that have high numbers of indigenous students. So a couple different MSI categories there. So, but with respect to, now to go back to your question, with respect to what we found here, the Pacific Islander population is located where Sacramento State is actually pretty small comparatively to other parts of the country, and so that wasn't a big chunk of their student demographic, the university's demographic, and thus not a big chunk of Sac State's population. So in this example here, not so much, but certainly there are other institutions around the country that have larger numbers of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students and are doing really, really important work there.
Absolutely. And you think about minority serving institutions and institutions that are doing it well with the students who they are serving, right? If they are serving those students well and thinking about ethnic studies, you would think that the other students of color would be benefiting from those services as well, right?
Yeah, I think that tends to be, and this is actually an interesting point, being that Sacramento State is actually now a dual serving MSI. They not only have ANAPZ status and funding, but they also have HSI status and funding. And so there are collaborations between both kind of programs to broadly serve all students of color on campus using an ethnic studies based curriculum, which is fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Nguyen, so open coding was used to interpret the data, and the article mentions it brings out new ways of thinking. Can you talk a little bit more about this? I know that you identified 3 primary categories after 3 waves of coding. What is this process?
Yeah, and so we chose this kind of grounded theory approach mainly because, to be honest, this publication was the first, I think it's the first ever article in a peer-reviewed journal that's about ANAPZs. Prior to this, there had been a handful of policy reports and book chapters, but never before a peer-reviewed journal article about a 4-year ANAPZ. And so what that means is that there's not a whole lot of knowledge about this type of MSI and at this type of institution. And so we chose this grounded theory open coding in order to really allow it to inform, allow the participants to let us know what's happening, right? Versus us coming in with a set of hypotheses that we wanted to test, right? We wanted to instead uncover what was happening because nothing had ever been written before, and make sure that what the findings that emerged from our study really came from the participants.
I like how the article at the end, as far as looking forward and recommendations, talked about an ethnographic study to go more in depth, realizing that sometimes perspectives may change depending on what's going on during that time. So I love how the article ended with that. I thought that was great. So dominant cultural norms and predominantly centered on whiteness, right? It's a historical structure. What are the ways in which other ANAPZs or MSIs can be more intentional about creating success, validation, a sense of belonging for their students of color? The article mentions ethnic studies, the centralized hub. Can you elaborate on other ways you would recommend to address the cultural mismatch?
Sure, and I love this question, by the way. So thank you for asking it. So what this study, as well as some of our other work and some of my other work on ANAPZs have uncovered, is that there's a couple of different ways to really enhance the student experience and benefit students at ANAPZs, and we think these are transferable for other MSIs. And typically, right, and this really comes from actually a bit of a disconnect with respect to the federal policy. Federal policy for ANAPZs and some other MSIs really are pushing and evaluate these ANAPZs based on end of the day student outcomes, right? Retention rates, graduation rates. et cetera. And don't get me wrong, all that is extremely important. And that's one good way to measure student success, but it's not the only way. And so what we see from Sac State's Anapesi, as well as some others that we've examined, is that the way to enhance these outcomes for students isn't necessarily just to provide them with tutoring services and homework help services, but instead to build a kind of comprehensive program that involves curricular and co-curricular activities that speaks to their experiences as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And what we see from that is not only are students becoming more engaged in the classroom, as well as being more engaged in their communities, that because of that, they are doing much better in their academics and in their eventual careers once they graduate. And so some of this is all qualitative work, but I'll use a quantitative term, which is we think there's an indirect effect that's happening. And I think in judging from institutions that tend to be the models for newer MSIs, the ones that are doing a good job and the ones that are models tend to be ones like Sac State, like De Anza College, like UMass Boston, where they are doing a larger comprehensive approach for their students rather than just simple little programs here and there that could be a little bit more disconnected.
Sure, thank you. So what's next? I know you're teaching a minority serving institution seminar next quarter, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And do you have plans to do more research? I know you also mentioned your book chapter that's coming out next year. And I was just wondering, because the article mentions more research for the future is comparing how other institutions might look in the comparative analysis with the program at Sac State. So are you looking at any of those things, or are you looking at other research in the future?
Absolutely, and thank you for this question. There's a couple interesting trends that are happening that we're starting to see with respect to Anapesis as well as other MSIs like Hispanic serving institutions, and that is we're seeing kind of these big flagship universities becoming MSIs, which is a very new and recent phenomena, right? In the case of Anapesis, there are now 2 institutions, one in California, one in Minnesota, that are both flagship, kind of big, large public flagship institutions that have become Anapesis. And we see the same thing happening with Hispanic serving institutions. And so the question is, what's going on here, right? We know the literature on community colleges and Anapesis, as well as regional comprehensive universities and Anapesis, that's beginning to come out, and a lot of our work has been in that area. But now we're seeing a whole new Carnegie classification become Anapesis, and so there's a lot of work to be done at those institutions to figure out how do we best serve students of color there. The other thing I think that's really interesting with respect to Anapesis and Hispanic serving institutions is that in the case of, say, Sacramento State and a handful of other institutions, they are now being dual designated. And so that opens up a whole lot of interesting things worthwhile in studying at both those institutions. So if anybody in this class is interested in MSIs, there's a lot of important work that needs to be done. And I'm happy to collaborate with anybody. So come and knock on my office door, and we can find ways where we can all work together and build new knowledge, right, in this area of higher ed research. But also, equally important, if not more important, is to help us find and uncover some interventions where we think we can impact practice and policy and improve the educational experiences for students of color.
Thank you so much for meeting with us today, Dr. Nguyen. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. What an honor, and I hope to meet everyone in the class in person at some point. So stop by and say hello, and do sign up for my MSI class next winter quarter.